On a very early morning in December of 1991, a woman living in the quiet community of Largo, Florida, was pulled from her sleep by a sound she couldn't quite place. It was a loud, rhythmic pounding. As she sat up in her bed, her mind still clearing the fog of sleep, she realized the sound was coming from her front door. But it wasn't just pounding. Layered over it was a desperate sound, a woman screaming for help. Realizing this was a genuine crisis, the woman didn't hesitate. She threw off her blankets and rushed to the front of her house. She unlatched the locks and pulled the door open, and what she saw on her front porch made her stop cold. It was her neighbor. And this neighbor was almost completely covered in blood. It was matted in her hair, streaked down her face, and soaked into her nightgown. There were deep gashes on her head, and a long, terrible wound across her throat was still bleeding freely. Before the neighbor could even manage to say what had happened or what was wrong, her eyes rolled back in her head and she just collapsed right there on the porch, unconscious. On the evening of the 14th of December, 1991, just hours before this chaos erupted, 1 year-old Keith Young was grabbing his car keys from a small hook by the front door of his home, also in Largo, Florida. Behind him, his wife Anita was slipping on her favorite pair of heels, getting ready for a night out. The newlyweds were about to head out for a much-needed date night. Life for them was hectic, to say the least. This was the second marriage for both of them, and between the two of them, they had a blended family of 6 children from their previous relationships. Finding time for just themselves was a rare and precious thing. But on this particular night, the stars had aligned. Keith's 2 kids were spending the weekend with their mother, who shared custody. Anita's 8-year-old daughter was at a sleepover with a friend, and her 2-year-old son, a mature and responsible kid named Jason, had agreed to stay home and watch his 2 younger siblings so the adults could finally have a quiet dinner together. Before they walked out the door, Keith gave Jason a final rundown of the rules and expectations. Don't make a huge mess. Make sure nobody gets hurt. And just in case there was some kind of emergency, he had written down the phone number of the restaurant on a notepad in the kitchen. But Keith also made sure to remind Jason that if there was a real emergency, a true crisis, he shouldn't hesitate. He should call 911 right away. Jason, with the classic confidence of a 2-year-old, just kind of rolled his eyes and gave his stepdad a look that said, Yeah, I've got this. It's under control. Now, Keith knew he was probably being a little uptight, a little overprotective, but there was a reason for his anxiety. Earlier that same year, there had been an attempted break-in at their house, and the incident had left him on edge ever since, especially about leaving the kids home alone. The intruder in that incident had done something very specific and unsettling. They had cut the home's phone lines before trying to get in. They had also removed a window screen and even tried to force a door open. But for some reason, they had left without taking anything. The police had investigated, but critically, the suspect was never caught. So for the family, it was this unresolved, lingering threat that made them feel unsafe in their own home. Keith and Anita both gave Jason a big hug goodbye as they walked out into the cool Florida night. And once the front door clicked shut behind them, Keith, just to be extra sure, turned back and jiggled the handle, double-checking that it was locked. Less than half an hour later, Keith and Anita were sitting across from each other at a table in a quiet restaurant. They unfolded their napkins onto their laps, the simple act feeling like a luxury. They were so excited to have a few hours of peace, a chance to focus on each other, something that their busy lives rarely allowed. The couple had gotten married earlier that year. They had met at a support group for single parents, a place where they both found someone who understood the challenges they were facing. They were incredibly grateful to have found each other, especially because their previous marriages had been so difficult. Anita's ex-husband, a man named Luther Bass, had a notoriously violent temper. And even though he now lived all the way across the country in Idaho, he still seemed to find ways to complicate Anita's life. Just that past summer, Luther had driven all the way from Idaho to Florida to pick up his kids for a vacation, something Anita had initially agreed to. But when he arrived, he wasn't alone. He showed up in a camper with his new girlfriend and her children. The whole situation gave Anita a terrible feeling. She became deeply worried that if she let her kids go with him, Luther might just refuse to bring them back. This led to a huge argument right there in the driveway. It got so heated that Anita eventually had to threaten to call the police before Luther finally backed down and left in a rage. Meanwhile, Keith was having his own set of problems with his ex-spouse, Linda. They were in the middle of equally heated arguments about where their kids would spend the upcoming holidays. Would they be with him and Anita, or with Linda and her new husband, Steve? Things had gotten so nasty between them that Linda had recently started harassing Anita, making angry phone calls to the house. She was also gearing up for a legal battle, threatening to go back to court and try to get the custody agreement changed if Keith didn't agree to do things her way. But all of these conflicts with their exes only made Keith more grateful that he had found Anita. He was happy that he could finally provide for her and her children, to take care of them in a way he felt they truly deserved. So, despite all the tension hanging over their lives, he did his best to keep the mood light during dinner. They enjoyed their meal, talking and laughing, and for a couple of hours, they were able to forget about everything else. When the check finally came, Keith glanced down at his watch and was surprised to see how late it had gotten. He knew Jason was a responsible kid and could definitely handle getting his younger siblings into bed on his own, but that old worry about leaving the kids alone for too long was creeping back in. So, he paid the check right away, and he and Anita left the restaurant and started the drive home. A little while later, they pulled up outside of their brown single-story house. As they walked inside, Keith felt a wave of relief wash over him. The house was quiet. All the kids were calmly watching TV in the living room, and the family cat was curled up asleep on the couch right next to them. Keith announced that it was time for everyone to get ready for bed. As one 2-year-old, Jason got up from the couch, Keith pulled him in for a big hug and told him how proud he was of him for doing such a good job babysitting. Anita helped the younger kids brush their teeth. And afterwards, Keith went through the house, turning off the lights. He went down the hall and said goodnight to all 3 kids, who were climbing into their bunk beds in the room they shared. After that, he continued down the hallway to the main bedroom, where Anita was already waiting. He climbed into bed, kissed his wife goodnight, and then turned off the light. Several hours later, around 3:00 in the morning, Anita's 2-year-old son, Jason, was jolted awake by a very loud noise. He sat bolt upright in his bed. He listened, trying to figure out what he had just heard. Then he could hear something else, a thumping sound coming from the room next to his. But before he could even begin to process what was happening, someone screamed. It was a terrifying, panicked sound. With his vision still blurry from sleep, Jason carefully slid off the top bunk. He crept over to his bedroom door and cracked it open just enough to see into the hallway. In the dim, shadowy light, he could make out the shapes of what looked like 2 men. They were moving around, struggling with each other, fighting. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, he realized with a jolt of terror that one of those men was his stepdad, Keith. He couldn't make out any details about the other man, except that he was very big and was wearing a black ski mask over his head. Jason was immediately paralyzed by fear. He knew instantly that this was another intruder, just like the one who had tried to break into their house that summer. For a split second, he held on to a desperate hope that maybe his stepdad would be able to fight the man off. But then, in a flash of movement, he saw something that made his stomach drop. There was blood sprayed all over the walls of the hallway. And then he saw the glint of a knife in the intruder's hand. At that exact same moment, Jason saw his mother, Anita, run out of the master bedroom. She was also covered in blood. She was holding a baseball bat, and she swung it with all her might at the intruder, hitting him hard in the back of the head. But the blow barely seemed to slow him down. And that's when Jason heard his stepdad's voice, strained and desperate, yelling for Anita to get the gun. Anita turned and ran into another room. Jason just stood there, frozen behind the door, watching through the crack in a state of shock as this huge intruder literally picked Keith up off his feet and threw him back into the master bedroom. The next thing Jason knew, his mother was back in the hallway. She was standing there holding a gun. And the intruder, seeing this, turned and ran, sprinting away and out the front door. Suddenly, Jason snapped out of the shocked trance he had been in. He remembered what Keith had told him to do in case of a real emergency. Call 911. He ran to the phone in the kitchen, snatched it up, and dialed the numbers. But when he put the receiver to his ear, all he heard was dead silence. There was no dial tone. The line was completely dead. Jason looked over and saw his mother hobbling towards him. She was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, and he could see blood visibly dripping down her neck. Jason's voice cracked as he told his mother that the phone wasn't working. Anita, barely able to stand, told her son to go back and wait with his stepdad. She said she was going to go find help. So Jason started walking back towards the bedroom where he knew his stepdad was. As he did, he watched his mom stumble out the front door and disappear into the night. Jason went down the hallway and into the master bedroom. He saw his stepdad sprawled out on the bed. He was still alive, but he was clearly struggling to breathe, making a terrible, raspy sound. Jason, a 1-2-year-old kid, faced with an impossible situation, had no idea what to do. So he just walked over to the bed, knelt down beside it, and took Keith's hand. He just held it while he waited for his mom to come back with help. And as he held Keith's hand, he listened to the sound of his stepfather taking his last few labored breaths before he went completely limp. Several hours later, just before dawn on the morning of the 15th of December, 1991, Detective Mike Short from the Largo Police Department pulled his car up to the curb outside of a brown, single-story house. The entire property was surrounded by yellow crime scene tape. He'd gotten a call from his supervisor, who didn't have a lot of details, just that an intruder had broken into this house and attacked a husband and wife while they slept. But now, as Short got out of his car and looked around at the quiet block of modest, well-kept homes, he found the whole situation a bit odd. This just wasn't the kind of neighborhood where they saw violent home invasions. It was a peaceful, family-oriented area. As Detective Short walked up towards the house, a uniformed officer met him and gave him a few more details about what they knew so far. He said that the wife, Anita Young, had managed to run to a neighbor's house screaming for help before she passed out from blood loss in their front yard. The husband, Keith Young, was deceased inside in the bedroom. The officer also said that the couple's 1-2-year-old son had woken up at some point during the night and had witnessed part of the attack. For now, the boy was safe over at the neighbor's house until they could track down another guardian. The officer told Short that Anita had been rushed to a hospital, but it would be a miracle if she survived. Her injuries were some of the worst the first responders had ever seen. As Short went up the walkway that led to the front door, he saw that blood had dripped all over the cement path. The front door was wide open, and just inside, he saw a baseball bat lying on the floor. There was blood on the handle. Short stepped over it and into the house, and he was met with the sight of more blood. It was spattered and smeared basically everywhere in the living room, on the walls, the doors, the furniture. It looked as if the suspect and the victims had been engaged in a desperate, moving fight all throughout the house. In fact, the scene was so chaotic and messy that Short's first thought was that maybe the suspect wasn't expecting to have to fight off two grown adults. Otherwise, they might have come up with a more efficient plan of attack. So, Short's initial assumption was that this was likely a robbery that had gone terribly, horribly wrong. As he continued down the hallway, a cat suddenly ran past him. It seemed to be unharmed, and it quickly went to hide under the couch. The hallway, almost unbelievably, was even bloodier than the living room. There were red smears all over the walls and the floors. So Short figured that the main part of the struggle must have happened right here. Short reached the main bedroom and looked inside. He saw Keith's body lying on the bed, covered from head to toe in blood. Keith's shirt was shredded, and Short could see that he had multiple stab wounds to his chest and also a very deep gash running down his side. Short decided not to actually enter the bedroom until the crime scene technicians had gone through it for forensic evidence. So instead, he just walked down the rest of the hallway and pushed open the door to another bedroom. He was surprised to see two small children, a boy and a girl, soundly asleep in their bunk beds. Somehow, these little kids had slept right through the entire violent attack. Short immediately went back outside and flagged down a uniformed officer. He told him to go in there, gently wake up those kids, and bring them somewhere safe. Once the officer went inside, Short pulled out his flashlight and began searching the yard for any more evidence. Based on the wounds he had seen on Keith, Short thought he was probably attacked with a knife or maybe even something larger, like an axe or a machete. But apart from that bloody baseball bat that was found in the doorway, there was no sign of a weapon anywhere inside or outside of the house. But as Short made his way around to the side of the house, he found something else that was very interesting. The home's phone lines had been very clearly and deliberately cut. This changed everything. The killer must have planned ahead. They had made sure that nobody in this house would be able to call out for help. And this was so interesting because nothing else about the chaotic scene suggested that this crime was carefully planned. In fact, in many ways, it looked like it was very unplanned. But now, Short had to consider that maybe this was not just a random robbery gone wrong. Maybe, especially given the cut phone lines, this was a premeditated attack, a premeditated murder. And if that was the case, he had to figure out who the intended target was. Was it Keith, or Anita, or both of them? A little while later, Detective Short walked up the street to the neighbor's house to speak with his best and only eyewitness, Anita's 1-2-year-old son, Jason. After Short knocked, the neighbors led him inside and showed him into their living room. He saw Jason sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, still wearing his pajamas. Short sat down across from him and told him that he knew it must be extremely difficult to talk about this, but he really needed to know exactly what he had seen and what he had heard during the attack. Tears began to roll down Jason's face as he began to describe the terrifying scene of watching his mother and stepfather fight off the intruder. Jason said he couldn't really describe what the person looked like because they were wearing a ski mask, but he was pretty sure it was a man. He also said that there had been a little bit of skin exposed on the killer's neck, and from the looks of it, it appeared like their skin was maybe fairly dark. So Short wrote down in his notes that the suspect likely had dark skin. But because it was so dark in the hallway, and Jason clearly had not gotten a very good look at the killer, he knew the boy could be mistaken. So he just put it down as a possibility. Short then asked Jason if the intruder had said anything during the attack. Jason just shook his head and said no. He said the intruder didn't say a single word the entire time. Short made a note of that too, because it made him wonder if maybe the killer was someone close to the family. Someone who knew that if they spoke, their voice might be recognized, even by a 1-2-year-old boy. Later that same morning, once the sun had fully come up, Short went back to Keith and Anita's house. He searched the outside of the property again, just in case he had missed anything in the dark. And while he was searching the front yard, another police cruiser pulled up to the curb. A female officer got out and walked over to Short. She asked if he was the lead investigator on the case. When he confirmed that he was, the officer told him that she had been waiting at the hospital all morning, and Anita had finally woken up enough to say a few words. She said Anita was only awake for a few minutes before she had to be rushed back into another surgery, but it was just long enough for her to answer a couple of questions. Anita had described waking up to see a man standing over her bed with an axe in one hand and a knife in the other. She said it was a man she had never seen before in her life. She didn't recognize anything about him. The officer said that right before Anita was taken off to surgery, there was one more thing she had mentioned. There had been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and the intruder during that break-in had also cut their phone lines. Short instinctively turned and looked at the side of the house where those lines had been severed. He thought to himself, this is just too strange of a coincidence to be ignored. Later that day, back at the station, Short read through the reports on the interviews his team had conducted with Keith and Anita's other children and their neighbors. A team of 5 detectives had been assigned to the case, and they had made quick progress on collecting background information on the victims. Everybody in the neighborhood had described Keith and Anita as a very normal, happy couple. Keith was an air conditioning technician who had been working at the same company for a very long time, and Anita was mostly a stay-at-home mom who did some accounting work on the side. However, what also came out in these interviews was that both Keith and Anita had ex-spouses who could potentially have a motive to hurt them. Anita's ex-husband, Luther, lived thousands of miles away in Boise, Idaho. But Short knew that despite the long distance, it was not impossible that he might have traveled to Florida to commit this crime. So Short picked up the phone and called the Boise Police Department. He told them about the attack and asked them to track down Luther and question him immediately. As for Keith's ex-wife Linda, Short had learned that she actually lived right there in Largo. And Keith's 2 kids from their marriage were still at her house, completely unaware that their father was dead. And since Linda and her new husband Steve were now potential suspects, Short wanted to be the one to break the news to them. He wanted to see how they would all react. So he looked up Linda's address in the police database, then grabbed his keys and headed out the door. Less than an hour later, Short parked his car in Linda's driveway and walked up to her front door. He knocked, and a woman opened it. Short asked her if she was Linda, and she said yes. He then flashed his badge and said he'd like to come inside and speak with her. Linda seemed a bit confused by the visit from a detective, but she opened the door wider and let him in. Short walked into what seemed like a perfectly normal Sunday morning. The house smelled of eggs and bacon. The 2 kids were in the living room, watching cartoons with a man who Short figured must be Linda's new husband, Steve. Short asked Steve to leave the kids and come into the kitchen with him and Linda because he needed to speak to both of them. Once all 3 of them had sat down at the kitchen table, Short got straight to the point. He broke the news that Keith had been murdered. And then Short watched as Linda's face crumpled and she literally collapsed into Steve's arms, sobbing. Short gave them a minute to compose themselves, but then he cut right to the chase. He asked where Linda and Steve had been at about 3 a.m. that morning. Linda seemed shocked to realize that the detective was considering both her and her husband as suspects. But through her tears, she choked out that they had both been at home, in bed with the kids, sleeping. Steve just nodded in agreement. He said they had all been home together all night long. That was it. Nothing about their demeanor or their reactions seemed overtly suspicious to Short. But when he pressed Linda about what her relationship with her ex-husband was like, she admitted that it was very contentious. She told him that just a couple of days earlier, she had spoken to a lawyer about potentially changing their custody agreement. Short found the timing of this to be a little too convenient. And he wondered, maybe Linda or Steve had decided that they would just settle the custody battle once and for all by simply taking Keith out of the picture for good. He also found it very convenient that Linda and Keith's 2 children happened to not be at Keith's house when the attack happened. It was only Anita's kids who were there at the time. But for now, Short thanked the couple for their time and told them he would be in touch if he had any more questions. Then he left their house. As he got into his car and drove back to the station, he kept going over the conversation in his mind. Linda and Steve's alibis were pretty weak. They were the only 2 people who could vouch for each other's whereabouts on the night of the murder. And what that meant was that Detective Short had every reason to keep both of them at the very top of his suspect list. Late that night, Short was sitting at his desk in his office when his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the police in Boise, Idaho. They had managed to track down Anita's ex-husband, Luther. Short immediately sat up straight in his chair and grabbed a pencil to take notes. The officer on the other end of the line told him that when they had first gotten to Luther's house, he wasn't there, but his fiancée, a woman named Connie, was. And she had told them that Luther had gone out on a weekend hunting trip. So the officers had gone out and searched for Luther in the area where he supposedly had been hunting, but they didn't find him. It wasn't until that evening that Luther actually arrived back at his house. The officer said that at that point they took him in for questioning, and he had told them the exact same story that Connie had, that he had been out elk hunting about an hour away from Boise all weekend. Luther had been able to describe basically every step of his hunting trip in great detail, but since he had been hunting alone, there was nobody who could corroborate his alibi. Now, Short knew that the drive from Boise, Idaho to Largo, Florida, where the attack took place, took at least 3 or 4 days. So, the fact that Luther was physically in Boise less than 24 hours after the murder meant that he could not possibly have driven there. But there was still a possibility that if he was involved, maybe he could have flown. Short knew it would be difficult, but not impossible, for Luther to catch a plane to Florida and back during the time that he was supposedly out hunting in the wilderness. So, he told the Boise officer to look into whether Luther had recently purchased an airline ticket and to also take saliva, blood, and hair samples from Luther for forensic analysis. After Short hung up the phone, he just sat back in his chair and thought for a second. It was less than 24 hours into this investigation, and he already had 3 prime suspects in his crosshairs: Keith's ex-wife Linda, Linda's new husband Steve, and also Anita's ex-husband Luther. And to some degree, Luther's fiancée Connie could have been involved, but based on the logistics and the fact that she was at the house when police arrived, it seemed unlikely. But there was one big problem. Based on the eyewitness testimony from both Anita and her son Jason, the suspect they were looking for was a dark-skinned man who Anita had never met before. And that description did not apply to any of their current suspects. Short knew that the suspect description might not be reliable. After all, it had been dark in the house, so Jason could have been wrong about the killer's skin color. And Anita was barely conscious during her brief interview, so her recollections might not be accurate at all. But if it was accurate, it could mean any number of things for his investigation. It could mean it was a random robbery after all, just some random person who broke into the house and did this horrible thing. It could also mean that one of his current suspects had maybe hired somebody to commit the crime. Or it could mean that all of Short's theories about the case were just completely wrong and he had no idea what had actually happened. Short rubbed his eyes and looked at the clock. He realized it was almost midnight. He decided it was time to go home and get some sleep. Maybe, he hoped, by morning, a new piece of evidence might turn up that would help point him in the right direction. Around 7 a.m. the next morning, about 28 hours after Keith's murder, Short pulled into the parking lot of Pinehurst Golf Course, which was located less than a mile away from Keith and Anita's house. And at this moment, Short was feeling really optimistic about the case because a groundskeeper at this very golf course had called the police that morning and said they had found a ski mask and a glove lying in the grass. So now, Short got out of his car and he went into the clubhouse. The groundskeeper was there waiting for him, and he said he had left the ski mask and the glove right outside exactly where he had found them. Short followed the groundskeeper out onto the course. As they walked, Short made a mental note of all the ponds scattered around the greens and also the large lake at the park right across the street. He wondered if maybe the killer might have tossed their weapon or weapons into one of these bodies of water. A minute later, the groundskeeper stopped walking and pointed down at the ground. There, lying in the grass, was a black ski mask and a dark-colored cotton glove exactly as promised. Short put on a pair of latex gloves and he knelt down. He carefully lifted up the mask. And as he did, he could feel that it was crusted with something reddish-brown, very likely dried blood. As soon as Short got back to the station, he sent the mask and the glove off to the crime lab for testing, hoping that they might find a trace of the killer's DNA. Then, Short spoke to his supervisor about sending a team of police divers out to search the water at the golf course and also at the park, just in case the murder weapons had been disposed of there. It seemed like a long shot that they would actually find something, but it was the best lead they had so far, and finding the weapon or weapons could really help them narrow down their suspect list. By the time Short got back to his desk, he saw that his answering machine was blinking. There was a new message. He hit play, and the message was from a man who said he had information on the Keith Young case. Short called him back right away. When the man answered, he said he was a college student who lived just a block away from Keith and Anita's house. And he said on the night of the murder, he and his friends had been hanging out in his driveway when they had seen a man jogging east down Coronet Avenue. Short immediately turned and looked at the map on his wall, and he got really excited because he saw that Coronet Avenue was the exact path the killer would have had to take to get from Keith and Anita's house to that golf course where the mask was found. Short asked the young man to describe this jogger. The college student said that it appeared to be a white man with short, dark hair. Short asked him if he was pretty sure about that, and the student said, yeah. In fact, the jogger had passed directly under a streetlight at one point, so they had all gotten a pretty good look at him. This was a huge development. Since 1-2-year-old Jason had said the killer had dark skin, it was very possible now that maybe Jason was wrong. But it was also possible that there were two men involved in the attack. Maybe one had dark skin and one had light skin. The following week, Short opened up a folder that had just been sent over from the police in Northport, Florida, a town about 85 miles away. On December 19th, just 4 days after Keith Young was murdered, a man and 3 kids in Northport had been shot to death in the middle of the night inside their home. The suspects in that attack were 2 men wearing ski masks, and they had also cut the house's phone lines. The similarities between these 2 killings were easy to see. But as far as Short could tell, the victims in the second attack didn't have any connections to the Youngs. Plus, the victims in that attack had been shot instead of stabbed. And so, as Short really did try to look for all the similarities he could between the 2 crime scenes, he just couldn't get over how blatantly personal the very violent and bloody attack at the Youngs' house had felt. So, even though there was this other on-the-surface similar killing in Florida, and even though Jason and Anita both swore they did not recognize the intruder, Short was not ready to rule out that Keith Young had been killed by someone who knew him. His strongest suspect was still Anita's ex-husband, Luther, who claimed to have been out hunting alone at the time of the attack. As for Anita, her condition had actually finally stabilized. And when Short had gone to speak to her at the hospital again, she had said that Luther was really the only person she could think of who might want to hurt her, because they had been arguing so much about custody and child support. But the Boise police had checked with every single airline in the country, and none of them had a record of Luther flying into Florida that weekend. So Short couldn't even prove that Luther was in the state at the time of the attack. And then Anita had also mentioned that she had been having problems with Keith's ex-wife, Linda. She said that Linda had been harassing her all summer long, calling her so many times that she couldn't even use her own phone. Short definitely still had his eye on Linda, but he still hadn't found anything that directly linked Linda or her new husband, Steve, to the crime. But Short was still very hopeful that this case would get solved, because a preliminary report from the forensics lab had just come in. It said that a single Caucasian hair had been discovered inside the black ski mask that was found on the golf course. This could point to any one of Short's main suspects. And Short knew it was only a matter of time before the forensics lab finished its full analysis of that hair sample, and then they would know for sure if it was an exact match. One day, in early January of 1992, a few weeks after Keith's murder, Detective Short got into the office and checked his answering machine. He found that he had gotten a message from the forensics lab telling him to call back right away. He picked up the phone and dialed the number, and he could feel his heart pounding as the line rang. This could finally be the break in the case he had been waiting for. When the technician picked up, he told Short that they had analyzed the hair found in the mask, and they had analyzed the DNA. But it was not a match for Short's top suspect, Anita's ex-husband, Luther. It was not a match. Short thanked the technician and hung up the phone, feeling incredibly disappointed. Now, this still didn't fully rule Luther out, especially because Short still thought there might have been 2 suspects involved. But he decided that at this point, it was time for investigators to really focus on other possibilities. Several weeks later, in early 1992, roughly a couple of months after Keith Young's murder, Detective Short knocked on the front door of Linda's house again. Linda is Keith's ex-wife. And when Linda opened the door and saw the detective once again standing outside her house, she quickly let him inside. The house was quiet, and Linda told Short that she was the only one home. They sat down in the living room and they ran through all the subjects that Short had grilled her on the first time around: her alibi, her custody disputes, her tense relationship with Keith. And none of her answers changed, and she really didn't say anything that could be viewed as incriminating. But as their conversation began to wrap up, Linda looked anxious, like there was something more she wanted to say. Short asked her what was on her mind, and she said that there was something she hadn't mentioned when they had spoken the first time. It was about her new husband, Steve. She said that a while back, after she and Steve had gotten married, she had briefly rekindled her relationship with Keith. Steve had found out that she was cheating on him, and he was, naturally, very upset about it. Linda said that a few months ago, Steve had even made a few dark jokes about hurting Keith. At the time, she didn't think he was serious, but after Keith was killed, she started worrying that Steve might have somehow been involved. She said that she had even gone so far as to check Steve's knife collection to make sure none of them were missing. Short was careful not to let his shock come across on his face, but inside, his mind was absolutely spinning. He had always thought it was possible that Linda and Steve were both in on the murder, but now it sounded like maybe Steve might have acted alone. He also wondered, though, if Linda was just ratting out her husband to draw suspicion away from herself. So, to help get to the bottom of it, he asked Linda to come with him back to the station for a polygraph test. He also planned to order another polygraph for Steve, who was suddenly at the very top of his suspect list. But almost 2 months later, in March of 1992, Short was back in his office, staring down at a pile of documents he felt like he had already read over 1,000,000 times. And the evidence still didn't point him toward anybody in particular. Linda and Steve had both taken their polygraph tests, but the results did not indicate they were guilty. And there was still no hard evidence that tied either of them to the crime. Also, after searching all the ponds and the lake in the area, police still had not found a murder weapon. And they had still not been able to match that single strand of hair from the presumed killer's ski mask to any of the suspects on their radar. Short still had really 3 main suspects who could have been responsible for the murder. There was Keith's ex-wife Linda, who had been fighting with him about custody. Her alibi was weak and was only supported by her new husband, Steve, who she herself had become suspicious of. And so Steve was also one of his primary suspects, because he had this terrible history with Keith and had even openly joked about hurting him. And then there was Luther, Anita's hot-headed ex-husband who lived on the other side of the country. Now, it would have been possible for him to fly from Idaho to Florida and commit this crime, but there was no proof that he did. And of course, there was still the possibility that this was just a random attack or a robbery gone wrong, and investigators still couldn't even be sure if they were looking for 1 or 2 or more suspects. They had no idea. So Short had plenty of theories, but still no evidence to back any of them up. The investigation had gone so cold that the task force assigned to the case had been reduced from 5 detectives to just 2. Short was starting to fear that Keith's murder might never be solved. But just then, Short's phone rang. And when he picked up the receiver, a voice on the other end said that they knew something about that previous break-in attempt at Keith and Anita's house, the one that happened a few months before Keith's murder. And as Detective Short listened to what this caller had to say, he suddenly knew exactly who had broken into that house and killed Keith and tried to kill Anita. Based on all the collected evidence, as well as the killer's eventual partial confession, this is what investigators believe happened to Keith and Anita Young on the morning of the 15th of December, 1991. At 3 a.m., the killer saw that all the lights in Keith and Anita's house were dark. They carefully snuck around to the side of the home and cut the phone lines, just like they had done a few months before. The first time they'd been here, they had second-guessed themselves and didn't go through with what they had planned. But this time was going to be different. The killer broke into the house easily, feeling calm and in control. They had an axe in their right hand and a large knife in their left. As they made their way through the dark living room, they heard a sudden growling and hissing. They looked down to see the family's cat standing in their path, its back arched. They thought about strangling the cat to shut it up, but decided against it. They wanted to do this with as little collateral damage as possible. So they bent down and tried to soothe the cat. When it worked and the cat became quiet, the killer stepped past it and began walking down the hall. They made it to the master bedroom. They slowly opened the door and stepped inside. Anita and Keith were fast asleep in their bed. The killer quietly walked over to the side of the bed that Anita was on. They stood there, looking down at her, getting ready to do what they felt they had to do. But as the killer was looking down at Anita, she stirred in her sleep and her eyes fluttered open. For a brief second, she looked up and locked eyes with the killer standing over her. Then, chaos erupted. They struggled and shoved each other, and their fights spilled out of the bedroom and into the main part of the house. This was not how the killer had hoped this would go. They had wanted to get this done quickly and quietly and leave without anybody waking up. But they had clearly underestimated Keith. He didn't stop fighting. And as the killer and Keith continued to stumble around and make their way back down the hallway, the killer suddenly felt something hard smash into the back of their skull. They turned to see Anita standing there behind them, blood running down her face and a baseball bat in her hands. The killer then heard Keith shout out for Anita to go get the gun, and he saw Anita run toward a nearby closet. At that same moment, the killer noticed a young boy looking out from a doorway nearby. And so the killer made a split-second decision. They just grabbed Keith and threw him with all their strength back into the master bedroom. And then the killer sprinted back down the hallway and out the front door. When they got to the sidewalk, they pulled off their ski mask and began to casually jog down the street, hoping that to anyone who might be looking outside their window, they would just look like an unassuming health nut out for a very early morning run. When they got to a nearby golf course, they stopped on the grass to change out of their bloody clothes. And after that, they stole a bicycle and rode away into the darkness. Things had not gone the way the killer had hoped. But as they reflected on what they had just done, they thought to themselves that, in reality, this actually could have gone much worse. They didn't kill the cat. And critically, no kids had been hurt either. And in some ways, that's what this was all about, to avoid hurting the kids. Because the killer was Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass. He had wanted to get Anita out of the way so he could have full custody of their 4 children and treat them the way he believed they needed to be treated. He felt like she was screwing up their lives, that he was the kids' only solution. They needed him, and so he had to do this. But Luther's own fiancée, Connie, had ultimately been the one to call the Boise police. She told them that Luther was the one who had cut Keith and Anita's phone lines a few months back before the murder. And she said she knew Luther had actually flown to Florida on the weekend of the murder using an alias and a fake social security number that he had gotten from a coworker. Once the Boise police finished speaking with Connie, they immediately called Detective Short in Florida to tell him what they had just learned. It turned out there was no second suspect. It was just Luther all along. 12-year-old Jason had just been mistaken about the killer's appearance in the dark, and Anita had been wrong about not knowing who they were, likely due to her severe trauma, the darkness, and the mask. As for that single Caucasian hair that had been found inside the black ski mask that Luther had been wearing, it's unclear how it got there. It was not Luther's hair, but it's possible that maybe somebody else had put the mask on at some point before Luther stole or acquired it. Luther Bass was arrested in Boise, Idaho on the 6th of March 1992, and he confessed to the crime on the very same day. A year later, he was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary with an assault. He was sentenced to life, plus 30 years in prison. As for Anita, she would go on to make a recovery from her horrific injuries. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of Wednesday, the 12th of April 2006, a dentist named Dr. John Yelnick was finishing up with his last patient of the day. He was working at his practice in the small rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He gave the patient a new toothbrush, a friendly smile, and told her to come back in 6 months for her next checkup. After she left, he walked into his back office and started to pack up his things for the day. Once he had everything, he walked back out through the empty reception area. He saw his receptionist getting ready to leave and told her to have a great night. She smiled and waved back as he walked out the door. But as soon as that door closed behind him, the smile completely vanished from John's face. The truth was, he was pretending. Pretending to be happy all day at work was becoming more and more exhausting. In reality, his life was filled with problems, and he was struggling under the weight of it all. He walked across the parking lot, got into his car, and started the short half-mile drive from his office to his house. John had grown up in Blairsville. It was his hometown, and it had always been his dream to build a life and raise a family right there. When he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have easily moved to a big city. He probably would have made a lot more money right away. But that wasn't what he wanted. Instead, he chose to come back home and join the practice of the very same dentist who had looked after his teeth when he was a kid. And it turned out to be a great decision. John's practice became incredibly successful. He had a natural charm, and he was especially good with children, which made his office a popular choice for families all over the area. He started making a lot more money than he ever expected. He was smart with it, too. He took the extra income and invested it in real estate. By the time he was in his 30s, John Yelnick was a millionaire. But for John, true success wasn't about the money. He felt like his life was truly complete when he met a woman named Michelle. Michelle was a single mother with 2 kids of her own. For John, this was perfect. It meant he was getting a ready-made family, something he'd always wanted. Some of his friends were a little worried. They quietly suggested that maybe Michelle was just interested in him for his money. But John never believed that. And any doubt he might have had disappeared when his own mother got sick with cancer. Michelle stepped up without a second thought and became his mother's full-time caregiver. To John, that was all the proof he needed. It showed him that Michelle's love for him was real. So, in 1997, John and Michelle got married. Shortly after, they decided to adopt a little boy together, who they named JJ. With Michelle's 2 children, and now JJ, they had a big bustling family of 5. They moved into a beautiful large house with a swimming pool and a hot tub in the backyard. From the outside, and for a while on the inside, it seemed like they had the perfect life. But now, as John pulled his car into the driveway of a different, much more modest house, he just sat there for a moment, staring at it. This was where he lived now. And he couldn't help but wonder how everything had fallen apart so completely, so quickly. The big house with the pool was a distant memory. These days, John was struggling with money. He'd always been a generous person, and he had loaned tens of thousands of dollars to various people over the years. But now, he was in the uncomfortable position of having to ask for that money back simply because he needed it to get by. His marriage was in an even worse state. He and Michelle had hit a rough patch that just never ended. It got to a point where they both admitted to having affairs. They were now living separately, which is why John was here at this small, quiet house instead of the family home he had built with so much hope. But the financial stress and the pain of his failing marriage were not the worst things in John's life. There was a third, much darker stressor that was consuming him. For the past couple of weeks, John had become absolutely convinced that someone was trying to kill him. It all started about 2 weeks earlier when he found his car had been vandalized. Someone had covered it in spray paint. The police came and took a report, but they couldn't find any suspects. Logically, having your car spray painted doesn't automatically mean someone wants to murder you. But John couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. It felt deeply personal, like a direct message. He felt like he was being targeted. Over the next few days, that feeling grew from a small worry into a full-blown conviction. He was so sure that his life was in danger that he took a drastic step. He went to his attorney's office and gave her $10,000 in cash. He told her that if he ended up dead, she should use that money to investigate his murder. John finally got out of his car, walked up the porch steps, and went inside his lonely house. He closed the door and locked it behind him, a habit he'd developed recently. The silence inside was overwhelming. It only amplified how depressing the small house felt. He wished his son JJ was there. When JJ was around, the whole house felt alive and full of energy. But with the separation, John didn't get to see his son very much anymore. Sometimes, long stretches of time would pass between their visits, and John missed him terribly. He took off his shoes and walked into the living room. There, on the coffee table, was a stack of legal documents he'd been trying to ignore. They were divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, back in 2003, but the process had dragged on and on. They hadn't been able to reach an agreement. To be clear, they weren't fighting to save the marriage. That was long over. In fact, Michelle was already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. The one thing they were fighting over, the reason the divorce had stalled for 3 years, was their adopted son, JJ. Michelle wanted full custody, and John was fighting with everything he had to not let that happen. He couldn't bear the thought of losing his son. But John knew that in less than 24 hours, this long, painful battle would finally be over. Their lawyers had at last worked out a shared custody agreement. Michelle had already signed her part of the paperwork. The next day, it would be John's turn to sign. He sat down on the couch and flicked on the TV, but he couldn't focus on it. He felt restless, on edge. He picked up the phone and called his aunt, who he was very close to. They talked for a while about the divorce and the custody agreement. He told her how relieved he was that it was almost over. When they finally said their goodbyes, John hung up the phone. He laid down on the couch, not even bothering to go to his bedroom, and soon he drifted off to sleep. The next afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zach Hughes walked out of his house and across the lawn towards John's house next door. Zach was hoping to see if John's son, JJ, was home and wanted to play. He knew JJ split his time between his mom's and dad's houses, so it was always a bit of a guess whether he'd be there. But as Zach got to the front steps of John's house, he stopped dead in his tracks. He saw that a small glass panel to the left of the front door was completely shattered. There were shards of glass all over the porch. And underneath the broken panel, he could see streaks of a dark red liquid that had dried on the house and the porch floor. Zach's heart started pounding. He knew instinctively that it was blood. His first impulse was to turn and run as fast as he could back to his own house. But then he thought about his friend, JJ. What if JJ was inside? What if he was hurt or in trouble? Zach felt like he couldn't just leave without making sure. So, mustering up all his courage, the little boy slowly walked up the rest of the steps. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked. So, being as careful as he could not to cut himself, Zach reached his small hand through the broken glass panel. He felt around on the inside, found the lock, and turned it. He pushed the door open and took a hesitant step inside. The first thing he saw was chaos. Papers were scattered everywhere across the floor of the foyer. And then he saw it. Lying motionless on the floor, in the middle of all the papers, was a body. It was covered in blood. At that moment, all of Zach's courage vanished. He turned around and ran out of the house, screaming for help. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Lead of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was in her car with her husband and their 4 children. Her radio crackled to life with a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally quiet residential street. The details were a bit vague. Dispatch told her it was a possible cardiac arrest and that her presence was needed at the scene. That was all the information they had. Thinking it was just a routine medical call, maybe an elderly person having a heart attack, Corporal Lyde drove her family straight to the address. But the moment she pulled up and got out of her car, she knew this was no cardiac arrest. A patrol officer was waiting for her on the front porch, and his face was grim. As she walked up to him, he pointed to the shattered glass panel and the dark stains on the porch. She asked him what was going on, saying she'd been told it was a heart attack. The officer just looked at her and said, "You know what? It's probably best if you just go in and look for yourself." Lead turned and gave a quick, reassuring wave to her husband and kids, trying to signal that everything was fine and she'd just be a minute. Then she stepped through the front door. The scene that greeted her was shocking. The entire foyer was splashed with blood. It was on the floor, on the walls, everywhere. And there, in the middle of it all, surrounded by those scattered papers, was a man's body. It was the most brutally mutilated body she had ever seen in her entire career. Now, Corporal Lyde had never actually worked a homicide case before. But as she stood there, trying and failing to count the number of stab wounds on the victim, she knew one thing for certain. This was not a heart attack. This was a murder. And it was now her first case. She also realized she was in a potentially dangerous situation. Because the call had been mistakenly logged as a cardiac arrest, a full police response hadn't been sent. It was just her and the one patrol officer on the scene. For all she knew, the killer could still be somewhere inside the house. And her entire family was sitting in a car just a few feet away. She immediately ordered the patrol officer to clear the rest of the house to make sure no one else was inside. Then she went back outside and stood in the front yard, positioning herself between the house and her family's car, her hand resting on the butt of her gun. It was a terrifying few minutes, but luckily she soon heard the sound of approaching sirens in the distance. At the same time, the patrol officer came back out of the house. He told her it was empty. The killer was gone. The only other thing he had found was a huge puddle of blood in the basement where it had soaked through the floorboards from the foyer above. At this point, more officers were arriving. Lade told her husband to take the kids and go home. She kissed them goodbye and then switched back into detective mode. She went back inside the house to begin her investigation. It was around this time that another officer told her the victim's name. It was Dr. John Yelnick. As crime scene technicians began the painstaking work of collecting evidence, Corporal Lead started her own slow, methodical walkthrough of the home. She wanted to get a sense of who John was and figure out exactly what happened to him. John's body was near the front door, but it was obvious that the attack had been long and chaotic. There was blood spattered all over the living room, which was where the scattered divorce papers were. John's body was barefoot. However, there were several bloody shoe prints in the house that were clearly not his. They were far too large to belong to Zach, the little boy who found him. Lead figured they must belong to the killer. The crime scene techs were already measuring the prints, trying to determine the shoe size. As she continued her search, she didn't see anything that looked like an obvious murder weapon. She also saw no signs of a robbery. The television was still there, electronics were untouched, and no drawers or cabinets seemed to have been ransacked. This made sense to her. The sheer violence of the attack suggested it was deeply personal. The killer hadn't come here to steal anything. They had come for one reason only, to make sure John Yelnick died a horrible death. She finished her sweep of the house and ended up back in the living room, which she believed was where the attack had started. That's when she noticed a check sitting on the coffee table right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to John Yelnick for $15,000. Attached to it was a handwritten note. The note asked John to please wait a few days before he deposited the check. The check and the note were signed by someone named Melissa Yuse. When Lead saw the last name, she did a double take. Yuse. That was the last name of the little boy, Zach, who had found the body. She wondered if Melissa Yuse was related to him, maybe his mother. In that moment, Corporal Lead realized she had her first two solid leads. Her victim was in the middle of a very messy divorce. And someone, possibly his next-door neighbor, owed him a lot of money that they apparently didn't have right at that moment. It was getting dark by the time Lead finally stepped back outside the house. A crowd had gathered on the street, a mix of curious neighbors and reporters. Murders were extremely rare in Blairsville, and she knew this was going to be a huge story. She just wanted to get back to the station and start organizing her thoughts for the interviews she needed to conduct. But before she could leave, another officer approached her with an update. Police had been going door to door, talking to the neighbors to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And they had come back with two very interesting pieces of information. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 in the morning, she was woken up by the sound of a scream. She said she sat up in bed and listened, but the screaming didn't continue, so she eventually just went back to sleep. The second piece of information came from another neighbor who also heard something around that same time. This neighbor heard a man yelling like he was in a very heated argument. They couldn't make out most of what was being said, but they heard one sentence yelled very clearly, "I'll never loan you money again." As soon as Lead heard that, her mind went straight back to the $15,000 check on the coffee table. This seemed to support the theory that the murder was about money. But the officer wasn't finished. He said there was one more thing. In addition to those witness statements, several of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one particular family on the block that detectives really needed to look into. And that was the Use family. Because, according to neighborhood gossip, Melissa Use and John Yelnick had been having an affair. The next day, April 14th, Corporal Lead was at the police station. She was sitting in an interrogation room across a small table from Melissa Use and her husband, Tom. This was Lead's first murder case, but she was a very methodical person. She had a clear plan. She was going to question Melissa and Tom very aggressively, even though in her mind they weren't her top suspects. Her number 1 and 2 suspects were John's estranged wife, Michelle, and her new boyfriend, Kevin Foley. She knew from her training that in a murder investigation, a divorcing spouse and their new partner are always the first people you look at. The night before, Lead had sent an officer to Michelle's house to inform her of John's death. But when the officer arrived, Michelle already knew. She told the officer she had heard that John died of a heart attack. The officer then had to deliver the difficult news that it was not a heart attack, it was a murder. According to his report, both Michelle and her boyfriend Kevin seemed genuinely shocked and upset by this. Corporal Lead actually knew Kevin Foley personally. He was a state trooper, and they had even worked together on cases in the past. Now, she was faced with the very awkward and sensitive task of investigating a fellow police officer. It was a very tricky situation. So, her plan was to gather as much information as she could before she confronted Michelle and Kevin. She wanted to try and rule out the Uses first. She was also waiting for the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled for later that day. Now, sitting in the interrogation room, she looked at Melissa and Tom. She started by asking them about the $15,000 check. Melissa answered in a shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been good friends since they were in 9th grade. She was planning to open a new bakery in town, and John, being the generous person he was, had loaned her the money to help her get started. But then, she said, he had suddenly asked for the money back. Melissa said she was a little disappointed, but she also knew he was going through a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She explained that when she wrote the check, she only had $14,000 in her bank account. That's why she left the note, asking him to wait a few days before cashing it so she could get the last $1,000 together. Lade watched Melissa very closely as she spoke. She seemed genuinely devastated by John's death. The issue with the money seemed like a minor detail to her compared to the loss of her friend. The obvious warmth Melissa felt for John raised another, more sensitive question. Lade decided she couldn't avoid it, even with Melissa's husband sitting right there. She looked directly at Melissa and asked her bluntly, "Were you having an affair with John?" Melissa's face immediately turned red. She stammered and said, "No, absolutely not." She insisted they were just very close friends, nothing more. At this point, Lead turned her attention to Melissa's husband, Tom. She asked him the same question. Was his wife having an affair with John? For a moment, Tom was completely silent. When he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry. He just seemed incredibly nervous. He completely avoided the question. Instead, he just kept repeating that he really needed to go, that he had to take care of his kids. Lead knew it was a blunt question, but Tom's reaction was extremely suspicious. By the time the interview was over and she let them go, Tom Hughes had firmly established himself in her mind as a serious person of interest. Before she left the station for the day, Lead checked in with the officer she had sent to observe the autopsy. He told her that the forensic pathologist had determined the killer used a knife with a one-sided blade to slash John repeatedly. In addition to the stab wounds, John's jugular vein had been severed by a piece of glass. He also had numerous defensive wounds on his hands and arms and cuts on his back, which suggested that at some point he had tried to run away from his attacker. Lead already knew the murder was brutal, but hearing the clinical details from the autopsy report reinforced just how violent and personal it was. Her first thought was that whoever did this must have truly hated John. And she already had a suspect, Tom Hughes, who had a powerful motive for hate, a potential affair between his wife and the victim. Despite her inexperience with homicide cases, Lead felt confident. She believed that if she was just allowed to work the case her way, slowly and methodically, she would be able to solve it. But she also knew that the case was getting a lot of media attention. There would be immense pressure from her superiors and the public to get results quickly. If she moved too slowly, she worried the case might be taken away from her, or another, larger police agency might be brought in to help. She didn't want that to happen, but she also refused to compromise her careful process. She would have to find a balance. The officer who observed the autopsy had brought back several evidence containers from the medical examiner's office. They contained John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and other tissue samples. Standard procedure was for Lead to immediately send these off to the State Police Crime Lab for DNA testing. But as she held those samples, she made a decision. She was not going to do that. She wanted to keep all of her options open. She needed to maintain complete control over every single piece of evidence in this case. So, after the other officer left, Corporal Lyde walked over to the department's evidence refrigerator, placed the container of samples inside, closed the door, and went home for the night. The next day was April 15th, 2 days after the murder. By this point, Corporal Lyde had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members. They all painted a similar picture of him. They said he was a great guy, a generous friend, and above all, a very dedicated father. Today, Lead was heading to John's dental practice to speak with his colleagues. She wanted to see if they had a different perspective, and she was glad she did. As soon as she arrived, the dental hygienist and the receptionist had a lot to say, and it was all about John's estranged wife, Michelle. They told her that during the long 3-year divorce battle, Michelle had made some very serious allegations against John. She had accused him of abusing their adopted son, JJ. The accusations were investigated, and even Michelle's own family didn't believe her. Officials ultimately declined to press any charges against John. But at one point, Michelle accused John of violating a stay-away order, and the police had come to the dental office and arrested him in front of his staff and patients. To John's colleagues, Michelle was a nightmare. They said she also called the office all the time, demanding money, and John would usually give in just to keep the peace. But, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, for the first time, John had refused to even take her call. This detail immediately caught Lead's attention. It wasn't just his colleagues who described Michelle as being obsessed with money. Many of John's friends said the same thing. They said it was Michelle who had pushed for the big flashy house with the pool. John had never been comfortable with that kind of lifestyle. To his friends, it was this fundamental difference between them that ultimately drove them apart. Lead started to piece together a possible motive. Maybe John and Michelle had a major fight about money just days before he was killed. Michelle calls, demands money, and John finally says no. Could that have been the final straw? Could that have pushed Michelle to do something drastic? Maybe. But Lead also learned something else. Michelle was still listed as the primary beneficiary on John's life insurance policy. If he died, she stood to inherit millions of dollars. So now there was a powerful two-pronged financial motive for Michelle to want John out of the picture. But there was a problem with this theory. It seemed unlikely that Michelle, on her own, would have been able to physically overpower a grown man like John and inflict such horrific injuries. It seemed more likely that John would have been able to fight her off. But then Lead considered another possibility. Maybe Michelle didn't do it herself. Maybe she hired someone to do it for her. Someone bigger, stronger. And with the potential of millions of dollars in insurance money, she certainly would have been able to afford it. As Lead left the dental office, she started to think about how she would approach her interview with Michelle and her state trooper boyfriend, Kevin Foley. Given the sensitivity of investigating another cop, she knew she couldn't make a move without having all her facts in order. This wasn't just her first murder case, it was the biggest case of her career. The media was calling her nonstop. She was determined not to screw it up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, 6 days after his murder. Corporal Lead knew that his friends and family were growing frustrated. To them, it seemed like the investigation was moving at a snail's pace. Lead understood their impatience. The case was under a huge public microscope from day one. And there was the strange fact that John himself had been paranoid that he was going to be murdered. It was either a bizarre coincidence or a chilling premonition. But Lead felt that the family didn't understand what she was doing. She wasn't just being slow, she was being careful. That was her process. Without any official guidance on how to run a homicide investigation, she was developing her own careful, methodical system, and for the next several months, she stuck to it. The crime lab hadn't found any usable fingerprints or foreign DNA at the crime scene. The bloody shoe prints didn't match any of her initial suspects. So, for the time being, her investigation relied almost entirely on interviews. She chased down every single tip and rumor, no matter how small, and systematically ruled them out one by one. And all the while, she kept a close watch on her three main suspects: Tom Yuza, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnick. But she made no move to arrest anyone. The public complaints, and especially the criticism from John's own family, sometimes got to her. But she was convinced she was on the right path. She just needed more time. That was until Melissa Use decided to hire a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, about 3 months after the murder. Lead got a call from Melissa. She was surprised to hear from her, and even more surprised when Melissa asked to meet at John's house. When Lead arrived, Melissa was standing on the sidewalk, but she wasn't alone. With her were two older women who Melissa introduced as a pair of psychic sisters. She explained that she had met them at a psychic tea party and that they had been having visions about the case. Lead was not happy about this. And she was even less happy when she learned that John's family, desperate for answers, had given the psychics permission to go inside the crime scene. But Lead also knew that John's family was at the end of their rope. If she wanted them to give her more time to conduct her investigation properly, she needed to play along. If that meant working with psychics hired by the wife of one of her suspects, then so be it. So, Lead followed Melissa and the two psychics as they walked into John's front yard. The sisters started talking about feeling hot and cold patches of energy. Lead did her best not to roll her eyes. They then went inside the house, which had been sealed but not yet cleaned. It was still splattered with John's blood. The psychics announced that they had a premonition that the killing had happened in the dining room area. They said they could see a knife and stab wounds and a bloody footprint. They declared that the killer drove a black or red car, and most importantly, they said that the killer was not Melissa's husband, Tom. Melissa seemed very excited by these revelations, but to Lead, it was all ridiculous. The bloodstains all over the house made it pretty obvious where the attack had taken place. The details about the stab wounds and the police investigation had been all over the local news for months. Anyone could have known those things. And the fact that these psychics, who were hired and brought there by Melissa, were now conveniently clearing her husband of any involvement was not convincing at all. As the group finally left the house, the only thing Lead could think was that the psychics had maybe, just maybe, bought her a little more time by taking some of the pressure off. She knew that John's family had completely lost faith in her abilities. But what they didn't know was that she still had an ace up her sleeve. She just had to wait for the perfect moment to play it. Fast forward to February of 2007, 10 months after the murder, Corporal Lead finally got her chance. John's cousins, fed up with the lack of progress, made an official plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office asking them to take over the investigation. Lead's reluctant cooperation with the psychics had bought her some time, but ultimately, John's family and Melissa Yuce had become more and more agitated by her slow pace. They felt the psychics had given them more information than the police had. The Attorney General reviewed the case and agreed. Corporal Lead was being taken off the case. On the surface, this was her worst nightmare. A bigger, more powerful agency was coming in to take over her investigation, just as she had feared. But, on the other hand, the agency taking over was the Attorney General's office, not the state police. And when she realized that, she knew her moment had finally arrived. This was the play she had been waiting almost a year to make. Lead went to the Blairsville police station. She walked to the evidence refrigerator and took out the small sealed container. Inside were the fingernail clippings and tissue samples that had been collected from John Yelnick's body during his autopsy. She had been ordered to send them to the state police crime lab 10 months ago, but she had disobeyed that order. In a total breach of protocol, she had hidden them away and waited. Now, with the Attorney General's office publicly taking over, the case had a much higher profile. It was no longer just a small-town murder. This new status gave Lead the leverage she needed. She could now justify sending the evidence to a much more powerful lab, bypassing the state police entirely. She could send it to the FBI crime lab in Quantico. Normally, the FBI wouldn't get involved in a case like this, but with the Attorney General's involvement, she knew they would accept it. So she carefully repackaged the samples, filled out the new paperwork, and sent the evidence off to the FBI. And then, she waited. The day the results came back, Lead was a nervous wreck. She knew there was a very real chance that her risky gamble was about to backfire, that she was about to look like a fool for sitting on crucial evidence for almost a year. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email from the FBI lab, her eyes widened. She read the report and then read it again. She couldn't believe it. Her strategy of intentionally slow-playing the investigation, of hiding the evidence and waiting for the right moment, had paid off in a way she could have only dreamed of. Finally, after all this time, she was looking at the name of John Yelnick's killer. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and the DNA results from the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened in the early morning hours of the 13th of April, 2006. Around 12:30 a.m., a red car pulled onto John Yelnick's quiet residential street. The driver killed the engine and the headlights, and the car coasted to a stop in front of John's modest brick home. The killer got out and scanned the dark street, making sure no one was watching. The neighborhood was silent. The killer walked around to the back of the house and slipped inside through an unlocked door. Once inside, they moved quietly through the dining room and into the living room. There, they saw John Yelnick, asleep on the couch. The killer was holding a single-edged knife. They walked right up to the couch, raised the knife high, and brought it down hard into John's body. John woke up instantly, screaming in pain and shock. He threw his hands up to defend himself, clawing and scratching at his attacker, managing to get skin and blood from the killer underneath his own fingernails. He thrashed and rolled off the couch, desperate to escape. He managed to get to his feet and stumble away, but the killer was right on him. The two men wrestled and fought in the small living room. The killer stabbed John again and again. During the struggle, one of them knocked into the coffee table, sending the stack of divorce papers flying across the room. Somehow, running on pure adrenaline, John broke free from the killer's grasp. He made a desperate run for the front door, trying to get outside, trying to get help. He made it to the front foyer and reached for the doorknob. But just as his hand touched it, the killer shoved him from behind with tremendous force. John flew forward, and his head crashed through the small pane of glass to the left of the door. A shard of broken glass sliced deep into his neck, severing his jugular vein. John collapsed to the floor and bled to death right there in the foyer. The killer stood and watched until John was completely still. Then they turned, walked back out the way they came in, tracking John's blood across the floor and out the back door. The killer was confident they would never be caught. After all, people trusted this person. They trusted this person with their lives. The killer was Michelle Yelnick's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley. The fact that he was a cop was the entire reason Corporal Lead had decided not to send the evidence to the State Police Crime Lab. Lade knew Kevin. She had worked with him and generally liked him. But as her investigation progressed, she kept hearing stories about how much Kevin seemed to hate John. He had apparently believed the false allegations Michelle had made about John abusing JJ even after they were proven to be unfounded. Lead had become increasingly paranoid that if Kevin was the killer, she couldn't risk the state police lab handling the evidence. She worried that evidence could be covered up, either by Kevin himself or by his colleagues trying to protect one of their own. The risk was just too great. So, she made the incredibly risky decision to hide the evidence. She slow-played her investigation for 10 long months, biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to get those samples to a lab she could trust. That opportunity came when the Attorney General's office took over the case, giving her access to the FBI. The FBI scientists found male DNA under John Yelnick's fingernails. And when they ran that DNA through their database, it came back as a direct match to State Trooper Kevin Foley. In the end, Kevin Foley was arrested and found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Michelle Yelnick, she stood to inherit millions from John's death, and her boyfriend was the one who committed the murder. But she was never charged with any crime in connection with the case. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.